Lewiston, Idaho, 5/30/71. Dear O.N., in regards to your request for a life history, I really don't know. Most life histories are obituaries and are written by someone else. I believe that everyone thinks about this at one time or another, but we all usually put it off for one reason or another. Mostly, I think, because when we get right down to it and start to tally up some of the things we did, it all seems pretty damn silly, so we leave the job to someone else, hoping they will be kinder to our memory than we could, in all honesty, be to ourselves. I expect that everyone's life is much the same in many respects. We look back at some things with regret at opportunities that we did not act on, regret that we acted a certain way on occasion instead of a different way, and regret for many things we did or said that later on, after more maturity and better understanding, we came to realize that we were wrong. But this is, after all, what life is all about. We gain wisdom from our mistakes and understanding from our follies. I suspect we are all alike too in another way, and that is the gratification we occasionally have in looking back and realizing that we handled such and such a situation pretty good, and if we had to do it over again, we wouldn't change a thing. In my own case, I accept the date I was born on faith I certainly don't remember it. I accept the same way the circumstances, which were simple and elementary. No hospital, no indoor plumbing, electric lights, or anything else electric. Doc Anderson, a local general MD in Rigby, with the help of a neighbor, Mrs. Goff, were in charge of the delivery, which took place in the home. November 16, 1909, in Rigby, Idaho, was, if it was like all other November 16ths I have seen there, was cold, raw, overcast, and perhaps blowing. My parents were trying to support a growing family and themselves on a 60-acre farm, of which more than half was not suitable for growing the money crops, such as potatoes and sugar beets. Housing consisted of a small two-room lean-to frame house, which at the time was shared by 4 older sisters, my parents and myself. There was another brother, Alvin, who died about 4½ months before I was born. He was just under 2 years old. A younger sister and brother were to come later, making a total of 7 children at one time, all living in this house. We must have been quite crowded, but looking back, I find no recollection of being aware of it. I don't even remember where everybody slept. Later on, 2 more rooms were added, with porches and so on, and the house then looked quite nice by standards of that day. I suppose it varies in different people as to how far they can remember back, but in my case, I think it was probably at least 4 years old. I can remember when I started to school, and possibly a couple of years beyond that. Mostly little things around the house and the arrangement of the kitchen, mostly the kitchen, because it was the hub of all family life. I remember a big wooden box behind the kitchen stove that was used to store firewood in. It was semi-dark in this box and warm, being close to the stove. And when it was not full of wood, I spent much time in it, even taking naps there. And I remember following my father around in all kinds of weather as he did his farm chores. And I remember the snow, the wind, the mud, and as winter left and spring emerged, I remember all the wonderful smells of the approaching summer, the smell of grass and alfalfa and the various fruit trees in bloom and currant bushes, especially the currant bushes, as they were low and accessible to reach and touch, to smell the blossoms and to watch the bees as they gathered the nectar for their honey. All kids that I knew were always getting bee stings. Seemed like 1 or 2 a week for me. I remember starting school, and I remember I was terrified. It was a shocking experience. I was torn away from the security of loved ones and familiar surroundings and forced to go 3 miles from home in unfamiliar and terrifying surroundings and associate with people who I did not know and I did not care to meet. To make it worse, I was not a fast learner. In fact, I was a very slow learner in the early grades. Later on I became quite good in reading, spelling, but had difficulty with arithmetic for many years. I do not remember many of my first teachers, but I remember the first teacher, Mrs. Nell Palmer, a very wise, patient, capable woman who taught many hundreds of dumb little boys and girls their first basics in formal education. I was not a good writer, and am not yet. The idea in writing then was that all pupils were to write the Palmer method of penmanship, and all pupils were to do this with their right hand. The first 3 years was a constant battle before the establishment conceded defeat. I could not write with my right hand, and I could not satisfactorily apply the methods of approved penmanship with my left hand. And I was finally allowed to write unmolested with my left hand, and the penmanship was more or less ignored. As I pass schoolyards now and I see the neat chain-link fences and the children playing at their recess games, supervised of course, I remember our own recesses, always unsupervised and always dominated by 2 or 3 of the town bullies. In the younger ages it seems that it is always the town kids who are more aggressive. They have had more social contacts and are wiser and more experienced. There was always 1 or 2 fights in our recesses, always dominated and won by some town bully, and the victim was usually some little country boy who couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. Later on, I had the satisfaction of noticing that most of these dominant, aggressive boys amounted to very little in adult life. Many of them got into trouble with one thing or another as they reached young adulthood. But in their time they were king, and there was many a bloody nose or black eye. There is great concern now about constructive work for growing children, but at the time I was growing up this was no problem. Each one of us had our assigned tasks on the farm, and it was necessary work, not make-work projects like so many that we have now. There was wood to cut, coal to bring in, stock to feed and water, beets to thin and hoe, potatoes to weed, and all assisted in various ways in the hay harvest. My father was a very impatient and nervous man, and it was an ordeal to assist him in anything that required teamwork. He knew about what results he wanted, but we, being inexperienced and still learning, were confused many times as to what we were expected to do. The results to anyone not participating in the project, I imagine, were hilarious. Along with all the unpleasant incidents that affect all families, we had many happy times. My father was a great storyteller, and as we had no radio or TV to interfere, many pleasant evenings were spent listening to him tell of his experiences when he was growing up in the early days of Utah. My mother was a better than average reader, and especially during the colder months the entire family would spend a whole evening listening to her read out loud from some book. I remember one incident that concerned a book of fiction, and she was reading through a very suspenseful part, and everyone was on the edge of their chairs, so to speak, when one of the girls shifted her position somewhat and was punctured with a knitting needle that had been left in some material on the couch. The resultant outcry brought pandemonium for a minute or two till we found out what was going on, and that finished the reading for that night. Besides my family association, there were neighbors with children of all ages, and we each had our own friends that we spent much time back and forth at each other's homes. We usually had 1 or 2 dogs, and they were great companions. Dogs at that time were not kept for pets. They had work to do, and they kept a dog's place. They were a great help in the management of sheep and cattle, and also protection as watchdogs. And they were not allowed in the house, and were not allowed to become one of the family to the point that we see today in the TV ads, slobbering all over somebody with their tongue and sitting in laps. As I became somewhat older, I was allowed to have a pony, and many happy hours were spent riding bareback, alone or with friends. My father always grew a few acres of potatoes, and these were furrowed out and cultivated with a 1-row cultivator. One horse was hitched to this implement and pulled it through the row, and the operator walked behind holding the device steady and guiding it. I was introduced to this job as soon as I was old enough to see over the handlebars, about 7 or 8 years, I guess. I was not able to harness the horse in the barn, as I couldn't reach high enough, so I led her out to an irrigation ditch and put her in this ditch, which lowered her back about 2 feet, and I was then able to stand on the bank of the ditch and slide the harness on. The collar presented some problem, as it fastens from the top, and I still could not reach it, so I put it on upside down and secured it, and then slid it up close to her ears, and was able to turn it around and then slide it back in position on the shoulders. Old Belle and I spent many a boring day out in the potato field, going up one row and down another. I mention this to show that there was always work, and everyone pitched in and helped. My parents were dedicated Latter-day Saints, both having been born in the church, from parents who had joined the Mormons in the early days of its organization. My father's father, Charles Alfred Harper, was a Quaker by religion in Pennsylvania when he first heard about the Mormon religion, and he joined the church and went to Nauvoo, where he was living when the prophet Joseph was killed in the Carthage jail. He came across the plains with the original Brigham Young Company and filled 2 missions for the church to England. My grandmother, Harriet Taylor, he met in England, and when she emigrated later on, he married her. My mother's parents both joined the church in Scotland. Her father was a sailor and had followed the sea all his life, John Sutherland. He married Catherine Nicholson, also of Scotland, and they later on emigrated to Utah, where they lived the rest of their lives. It was expected that all children on attaining the age of 8 years in our church be baptized by a male member holding the priesthood and authority to do so. Nowadays, this is quite a ritual involving a baptismal service in a chapel and a baptismal fount with all the appropriate dress for those officiating. When I was 8, there were no founts, and you were baptized in the nearest irrigation canal or river. My father, being an elder in the church, accordingly took me out to the canal shortly after my 8th birthday and brought Mother along as a witness and proceeded to baptize me. I remember the day was overcast and chilly, and there was a little float ice in the water. We waded into the middle of the canal, and my father took the proper stance in order to properly submerge me, and he then recited the proper baptismal prayer and put me under. I came up and he helped me out, and at this time my mother said, "George, you didn't get his foot under." My father replied, "Well, damn it, why in hell didn't you tell me?" We then proceeded back to the center of the ditch and did it again. The second time wasn't so bad. I was so cold by then I was numb and couldn't feel it. To many people, an incident like this would sound like sacrilege, but you have to understand the people and the times to appreciate the fact that things of this nature were not out of the ordinary. People generally are a product of their times and environment. This was a new country just being developed. The climate was harsh. The land was not yet developed to a point where it yielded much in crops. There was practically no money, and if you stubbed your toe, there was no one to pick you up but yourself. The people reacted accordingly. They were hardy, self-reliant, hard workers. Most had a minimum education, and most were somewhat rough in their speech. They were also God-fearing, dedicated to their church and their families, and lived to the best of their knowledge and ability the Christian life. There wasn't any shots or vaccination available then for the childhood diseases, and everything that came along we got, along with everybody else. I don't remember a time in my early childhood that someone in the locality didn't have a quarantine sign on their house. Then after the quarantine, there was the fumigation. Beds were taken apart and articles of clothing loosened and the houses shut up tight while it was fumigated, usually from formaldehyde or some other germ-killing agent. The family, of course, had to take up quarters outside for a half a day, which is usually what it took. This also had a fringe benefit in that it usually killed the bed bugs, which plagued everybody at that time, no matter how rich or poor. The United States became involved in World War I when I was about 8 or 9, and I remember school projects such as cutting old stockings into little squares to send to the soldiers at the front to clean their rifles with. Also, about once a month, a local group of boys old enough for military service would be called up, and they usually left in the early morning train. On this occasion, the whole town would be out to see them off, and we kids living in the country would make arrangements with the horse-drawn school wagon to leave 1 hour early so we could also see them off. My cousin, Lloyd Crystal, was called and sent to France and was later killed there by an exploding shell. As he was the first man lost in Jefferson County, the American Legion post was named after him and still carries that name. I also remember the many patriotic songs of that day and the intense feeling of the local people against anyone of German descent living in the area. Most of these people were patriotic Americans, but were constantly suspect because of their race origin. Many years later, the same feeling was generated against Japanese Americans. This should give you some idea of an average year in Idaho as it related to my first 10 years. Someday when the mood strikes, I may give you a peek at the next 10 years. Not everything, just highlights. Forgot to tell you that my father was very fond of music and in his early days played the violin for dances. Mother couldn't play the piano, but she could chord, and occasionally we would get the two of them to play. One of his favorites was Leather Breeches, and another was the one that went, "I danced all night with a girl with a hole in her stocking," and so forth. As my father got older, he developed some arthritis in his fingers and arm muscles, and it was difficult for him to hold the instrument properly. So these occasions grew less and less. He was a real old-time fiddler, though, and I can still see him in my mind's eye belting out one of those tunes and his foot tapping the time. Lewiston, Idaho, 2/19/78. Hi, Roanne. Well, I told you I would continue this one of these days, and here it is, 1978, and I'm about to do that. I think I've arrived at about 1920 or thereabouts, and things haven't really changed much. The First World War is over, and all the people are home that were overseas, at least the ones that could make it. The first influenza epidemic is over, or mostly over, and we don't see anybody going around in public with a white cloth over their mouth and nose. I don't think it did any good, but people were scared because so many were dying within 3 or 4 days, and they were doing anything that they thought might help prevent infection. The history books call the 1920 to 1928 the Roaring Twenties because of the great growth in business and so forth. Also, there was a lot of land speculation and stock market. Where we lived, though, I don't remember any great change in anything. I went to school during the prescribed months, was an average student, and worked at about everything on the family farm during non-school months, and had lots of chores to do morning and night during school months. And looking back, I don't remember thinking anything about it one way or another. We were no better or no worse off than any other family, and all were in about the same situation. All water for the house had to be carried in buckets drawn from a well with a rope with a bucket on the end of it. All kitchen stoves had a large container on the right side called a reservoir. This held about 5 gallons of water and would become warm from being attached to the stove. This had to be filled 2 or 3 times a day, as it was used for a supply of warm water to wash anything that needed washing. Drinking water was kept in another bucket at a washstand, and a dipper was kept in it. Anyone wanting a drink used it, and all drank out of the same dipper. There was a wash basin on the stand. Anyone wanting to wash up poured a little hot water out of the tea kettle on the stove and mixed it with cold water from the bucket. All the farms had a variety of animals, and these had to be cared for every day. Kitchen scraps and the dishwater would be saved for the pigs and carried to them in buckets and put in a trough to supplement the regular feed. Everything was saved, nothing thrown away. Cows had to be milked twice a day, and this was at a time all done by hand. We usually had about 5 to 7 cows, which was about average. The milk was separated. Each farm had a separator, which was a machine turned by hand and took about 10 to 15 minutes of turning. This separated the cream from the milk. And the skim milk was used to feed pigs, make cottage cheese, and various other things. The cream was sold in 5-gallon cans to the creameries. Each town had at least one. The farmer would take the cream into town when his containers were full and sell it to the creamery. The creamery made cheese and butter and so forth from the cream. To cut out the middleman, many farm wives made their own butter and sold it in town. Each household had a butter press, and the butter was made in a churn, which was also hand-operated, and took anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour of continuous turning. I believe it was during the 20s that we got our first clothes washer. This was a crude affair, but was better than what Mother had been using, which was a tub and scrubbing board. This washer was also hand-operated and consisted of a tub with a crude agitator in it, of wooden pegs, and about 6 inches long, set in a wooden plate attached to a shaft. The shaft continued on up and out of the washer and was again attached to a handle and a gear comb. To operate the machine, you took hold of the handle and you pushed and pulled alternately. This turned the agitator back and forth. The work was hard, and we usually spelled each other to keep it going. I don't want to bore you with all this, but I'm making a point. The point is that we have all become so accustomed to pushing a button or turning a dial, and all sorts of wonderful things begin to take place with an electrical brain to manage the beginning to the end. We forget that it wasn't always this way. In fact, we haven't had it this way very long. Power did start to come to the farms around Rigby during the 20s. At first it wasn't much. Electric lights were the big thing, and of course everybody wanted them. The power companies usually didn't want to take the initiative in getting electricity to the farms. And what happened most of the time was the farmers along a certain road went in together and made a deal with the power company. They had to pay the cost of the poles and the wire and the labor and a guarantee. Then the company would run the power in and wire the house, which the farmer also had to pay for. And in the end, the power company still owned all the equipment they had conned the farmers into paying for, and were collecting a fee each month to furnish the power. In the main, everyone was happy, and any farm getting electricity usually didn't take very long, from electric lights to putting it to work at other things, thus freeing the farmer for the first time in history from the day-to-day drudgery of supplying all the power to operating the farm with his own back or that of his wife and children. For spending money, which was rather scarce, I thinned or weeded sugar beets in the spring of the year, after we had got our own taken care of. Dad was very firm on this, ours first, neighbors second. Anyway, after we got ours done, I would usually go to a neighbor that needed help and contract some or all of his. For some of the time I worked with 2 of my sisters who were older than me, Ruth and Marjorie and myself, and sometimes Eleanor, who was 2 years younger. We would contract a neighbor's beets and thin them, and then later weed them. The going rate for beet thinning at that time was $7 an acre, and if you were a good thinner, you could thin a half acre a day. This was done with a short-handled hoe, and you were bent over all day, so it was hard on the back. The seed they use now is different, and thinning can be done with a long-handled hoe or mechanically. We would all work together and help each other finish rows and so forth, and then split the money. And that was about it for spending money till I got old enough to work on threshing outfits and in the hayfields harvesting. We didn't really need much money, though. I remember at the local celebrations I would always go, and I hardly ever spend more than $1 or so, and this was spent on soft drinks and ice cream and so forth. We lived about 3 miles from our church, and we kept 2 buggy horses. Sunday was usually a pretty busy day for the horse, so we changed off. One horse would be used to go to Sunday school, and then later in the afternoon the other one would be used to go to sacrament meeting. Some of the farmers with larger families had white-top buggies and used a team of horses. This was a larger, heavier buggy and had seats fore and back so you could seat 6 or 7 people in them. Most of us had the single buggy, which accommodated up to 3 people on the seat, and if you had to, there was a storage box on the back a couple more could sit in. The buggy was used almost every day. There was always some place that we needed to go. I had a pony and used this at all times when I went alone. Almost every evening after chores I would be out someplace with the neighbor boys. We all had horses and we found many things to do. It was a real enjoyable time for me. I don't recall that the weather made much difference either, as we seemed to be out somewhere most of our spare time, rain or shine. In the warmer months we would all get together and find a good swimming hole in one of the irrigation canals or the dry bed, a tributary of the Snake River, and we would go swimming, and usually before it was over, if the hole was big enough and deep enough, we would be swimming our horses across. Nope, there weren't any parents to supervise or swimming instructors, just us kids, and the ones that couldn't swim learned the hard way. Some took a little longer, but all learned, even the horses. I think my generation was perhaps the last one that celebrated Halloween in the traditional way of really doing a lot of taking apart and tipping over of outhouses and so forth. The next bunch that came along I believe were a little more civilized, and anyway a lot of the outhouses were being discarded then as indoor plumbing was fast catching on. But we did all the traditional things, and at times more, and it was all trick and no treat. About 1 in the morning we would usually break up and each go his way home. At that time of the year in Rigby the weather is quite cold at night, and I remember those trips with the sky clear and all the stars out, the dirt road frozen, and frost all over the horse from his breath. I thought it was beautiful then, and I still do. I had had some instruction in scouting, and I could pick out the different star groups. The horse would be walking along, picking the way, and I had ample time for looking and wondering about where our little world fitted in with all the others that was visible. No street lights to get in the way, just a kerosene lamp in some farmer's window, here and there, a mile or so away. $4.23.78. It wasn't long after 1920 that things changed rapidly in our community. Hardly anyone had an automobile except a few businessmen in town, and they didn't get very far out of town. I believe I was about 15 when Dad bought his first one, a brand spanking new Model T Ford in everybody's favorite color, black. He bought it from Lou Brossard in Rigby, who had a Ford agency, and probably paid $350 to $400 for it. Anyway, we had fun. Everybody wanted to learn to drive it. By the way, that was before driver's training and driver's licensing, too, for that matter. Well, of course we did everything wrong for a while. I and my older sisters learned how to drive rather quickly, and Mother didn't have too much trouble. But Dad finally gave up and would never touch it again. When he wanted to go someplace, I usually drove him, or Mother. He was president of the school board for a few years, and I usually had to drive him to the meetings and wait. I usually went into the assembly hall and waited, and I could hear their voices in the background coming from the principal's office. I could never hear very much distinctly, except once in a while when there was a difference of opinion, and then it would be loud enough to hear. I remember one meeting just after Dad had been elected, and there was a medical doctor on the board who lived in Rigby. He and my dad were always good friends, but there had always been some condescension on the good doctor's part until that meeting. After all, he was a medical doctor and an educated man, and Dad was a small farmer and never had any formal schooling after the 3rd grade. Anyway, at this meeting he apparently wanted to set things straight as to who was in charge, and there eventually was a difference of opinion between him and Dad, and it eventually became somewhat heated. And the doctor suggested to the president that if George couldn't get along and go along, he should be removed from the meeting, at which time Dad jumped up to his feet and was over to his chair in an instant, saying, "If you want me out, why don't you put me out, you SOB?" Well, the doctor was not a fighting man, and Dad was, and he had a reputation for it, so cooler heads got things calmed down, and the meeting went along smoothly. That was one conversation that was loud enough for me to hear in the assembly hall. Later, when there was a change in the setup, Dad was elected president of the board. Anyway, to get back to his driving, after I learned, he decided I was the best prospect he had to teach him to drive. I went through all the preliminaries with him, and I rehearsed him on his foot pedals. Everything was done with the feet, shifting, neutral, brakes, the whole works. After he got that figured out, I took him out on the road and had him watch and explain what I was doing and why and so on. Then after a mile I turned it around and headed for home and turned the wheel over to him. It was a lost cause from the start. He was actually afraid of it and would freeze at the controls when it started moving. He would just sit there gripping the wheel so hard it's a wonder he didn't tear it off. He wouldn't turn it at all, or he would over-control and start it off the road. Well, a Model T never did go faster than about 25 miles an hour, and I doubt we were going 15, but it was too much for him. He over-controlled once too often, and it left the road and went into the borrow pit. This panicked him, and he forgot everything he'd ever been told and started to holler, "Whoa, whoa, you son of a bitch!" Well, it wouldn't whoa, and finally veered into a bunch of willows and stopped. I got out and drove it, and him, home, and nothing was said all the way in, nor for that matter for several days. Finally he decided to give it one more try, and he asked me to take him out in the field where we had more maneuvering room. Maybe he could get the hang of it. I thought this was a good idea too, and for some reason both of us forgot about the dikes. On an irrigated farm, in order to get the water to run in a straight line, a farmer plows a dike about a foot high every 75 to 100 feet for the full length of the water run. Well, we got out in the field, and he started it up, and instead of going straight, he over-controlled again and started going in a circle. And if it hadn't been for the dikes, I guess we could have handled it, but he hit a couple of them sideways and almost tipped it over. And then we went all through the "whoa, you son of a bitch" routine again until we finally got it stopped. And that was the last time he ever touched it. I felt sorry for him, but there was nothing I could do. I know he felt bad and humiliated, but he never mentioned it again, ever. As I said, when things started to change, they did so quite rapidly, and in a few years things looked different. Homes were all electrified, everybody had cars, everybody was buying radios, small portables at first for about $15, then later the big consoles. It became quite a game. People would stay up all night to see how many stations they could pull in, and then brag about it all the next day. We did have radio a long time before television, though. I was married and had a family started before anybody had television. Radio changed family habits a lot, just as TV did later on. After radio was available, 7 p.m. meant something special, and everybody was there to listen to Amos and Andy and other great favorites from then until the late evening. It moved people closer together. Cities and places that had always seemed remote, like heaven or hell, were now in our living room at the turn of the dial, and newscasters of the day became familiar personalities. "Good evening, this is H.B. Kaltenborn speaking." "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, this is Walter Winchell." With the news he advertised for Jergens lotion, and he always signed off, until tomorrow evening with lotions of love. I and the group I was with started casual dating at about 16. This consisted mostly of going to dances as a group of boys and girls together, and some house parties, and in the summer some outdoor swimming parties and watermelon busts, as we called them. We would buy a bunch of melons and go swimming in an irrigation ditch and later eat watermelon. It was fun. When I was a sophomore in high school, we had a band leader by the name of Gifford come to town, and he set the town on fire. All of a sudden, everybody wanted a musical instrument. It was kind of like the Music Man play. Well, I wanted a trumpet, and I wanted it real bad, and they cost $100. I didn't have only about half of that, but my folks came through with money they couldn't afford, and I got the trumpet. It wasn't any passing fancy. I really enjoyed it. I took about 8 lessons from Gifford and quit because I couldn't afford to pay for any more, but I learned fast. We had first, second, and third trumpet in the band. I started third, graduated to second, and in my junior and senior year played first. We went all over, played 4th of July celebrations, 24th of July celebrations, and one time we went to Salt Lake City and played about 15 minutes in the lobby of the Hotel Utah. I forget what the occasion was. In my senior year, I started to branch out with other kids and form pep bands on our own, and also started playing for some of the local dances. After high school, I earned almost all my spending money playing dances. We usually played twice a week, mostly Friday and Saturday. We had a regular Saturday night stand for a while out on the desert about 50 miles west of Rigby, playing dances at Territon. This was way out in the bush at that time. It was kind of funny. The early part of the evening you would wonder whether you were going to have a dance or not, as just a few would come, and not many dancing. Then about 10:30 things would start to liven up, and by 11:30 everybody was really going good. It was the booze that did it. This was during Prohibition, but nobody out there paid any attention to that, including the law. Most of them made their own. We played on a guarantee, $5 each for 3 hours, 9 to 12. We always went through a routine at 12 o'clock. We played Goodnight Lady, which was our sign-off, and started to pack up our instruments. Everybody knew we weren't going anyplace. We knew it, the crowd knew it, but we had to play out the game. When we had our instruments about half packed, someone from the management would come up and say, "What'll you take to play another hour?" Then we would dicker for a few minutes and come up with a price, which was also always the same, and we would unpack our instruments and go to work. About 4 o'clock in the morning, they would be out of money and we would be exhausted, so everybody went home till next week when we did it again. I wasn't above taking a social nip those days, in fact 2 or 3 if the occasion demanded, but I met my match one night out there at intermission. One of the guys came up and asked if anybody would like a drink, and 2 or 3 of us obliged. In fact, I think everybody did, but the piano player, who was a girl, and she felt she shouldn't be doing things like that. Anyway, we went outside, and this guy had an old touring car with the top down, and he opened the back door, and there was a wooden keg lying on its side with a spigot in the end, about a 15-gallon keg. Nobody asked what it was. Everybody made their own beer, and many made their own wine, so anytime anybody offered you a drink, it was an adventure. I think we all assumed it was either beer or wine, but nobody was going to ask. He had some cups and told us to help ourselves. So I drew about a half a cup and still didn't know what it was, as it was quite dark. I took about 3 good swallows before really tasting it, and then it took me 30 minutes to get my breathing straightened out, and also my voice. Turned out to be White Mule, straight alcohol with no additives or sweeteners. That taught me a lesson. I don't remember now, though, just what it was, but I believe there was a moral there somewhere. During and after the last year of high school, most of us were more serious in our dating and were trying to effect steady status with certain girls. I had mine already picked and was trying to convince her it was a good idea. As I recall, this took some time, and I don't think she considered me much of a catch, as I traveled with kind of a wild bunch, and I'd wrecked my car several times. Looking back, I don't see why she didn't tell me to get lost. Who was the girl? Her name was Delia. I graduated from high school in 1927. Delia graduated in 1929. Classes then were fairly small, but we wanted to do it in style and be sure and have enough room, so we used the tabernacle, which seated about 1,200 people, and had an elevated podium and choir section and a pipe organ with real pipes, not electronic. Well, the day before our graduation, an earthen dam, which was caused by a slide 20 years before and had dammed up a creek, Gross Winter, making a small lake. This burst, and all that water came tumbling down into Snake River. Rigby is about 3 miles from the Snake, and so everybody was moving cattle and chickens and furniture to high ground, including my father, who was president of the board. I recall we had about 17 people out for the graduation, but we did it anyway. We never got flooded, but a lot of people did. It got a lot of livestock. I saw a horse come down the river at Lorenzo. He washed up into some trees out in the middle of the channel. There wasn't a thing you could do. He lasted about 2 days and finally drowned. My father died September 15, 1929. This changed our family pattern considerably. He had been failing for some time before that and having what he called gas attacks. He thought it was indigestion, but I guess it was actually his heart. He would get pressure in his chest area and have some difficulty breathing, and he took a lot of Pepto-Bismol or similar to relieve it. Nobody knew much of anything then, including the doctors, and about all they would do was try this and try that. The morning he went was Sunday. Mother had gone to Rigby to a meeting of some church committee she was on. The other family members living at home were at church at Rigby Meeting House. I didn't go and was home with Dad. About 10:30 he got an attack, and it was pretty bad. He went in and laid down on the bed and asked me to go to Rigby for the doctor. He looked at me and said, "One of these is going to get me one of these times." And that was the last time I saw him alive. By the time I got to Rigby, my car was hot from a leaky radiator, and I stopped and put water in it, and by the time I got to the doctor, he was gone. Never did find out how he got word, but when I got back, he was there, and Dad was gone. He said all his life he wanted to go quick, and he did. So if it had to be, it was nice he didn't have to suffer any more than he did. He was only 62, a fairly young man by today's standards. He was always a great worrier and had a hair-trigger temper. I think he would have lived another 10 or 15 years if he had been able to control this. His father was 78 when he died. But no matter how or when, death is as much a part of living as being born. There has been a great effort in America to ignore death. We try to make a deathless society. I think this is wrong. We speak of someone passing away. We have to put animals to sleep. Nobody ever dies. It's all a game, like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Many of our children are never prepared for death. They assume their parents and their grandparents will live forever. Personally, I agree with Robert Ingersoll. He said at one time when he was asked to speak at the funeral of a friend of his, "Why should we fear that which will come to all that is? We cannot tell and we do not know which is the greater blessing, life or death. We do not know whether the grave is the end of this life or the door of another, or whether the night here is not somewhere else a dawn. Neither can we tell which is the more fortunate, the child dying in its mother's arms before its lips have learned to form a word, or he who journeys all the length of life's uneven road, painfully taking the last slow steps with staff and crutch. I thought that was pretty good for an acclaimed agnostic. To get back to my story, if you're still with me, I worked the farm for a couple of years, I think after my father's death. My mother was determined that I go on a mission and kept encouraging me to go in case I got a call. There was at that time quite a bit of mystery in a way about the call. Most everybody felt it came direct from God, and when mine came I half expected to see his signature on the bottom of it, but it wasn't. And instead it was either President Grant's signature or some general authority, I forget which. I think people nowadays are a little more realistic about it and realize that mortal men arrange these things. I probably shouldn't have gone, but I did. I enjoyed it. It settled me down somewhat and started me to think about a few things that are important but I had never had time to think about. I baptized probably 6 or 8 people while I was out, served the whole time in New Mexico. The reason I think I should have not gone was my mother. She was a noble, intelligent, dedicated woman, but I don't believe she should have had to live like she did and sacrifice like she did to keep me out. Only used about $30 to $35 a month, but even this was more than she could cope with at times. And the day I got back, I went over to elementary school in Rigby because she had bid on a contract to haul rural kids to school on a route. This was with a team of horses and a covered wagon built for transporting kids. Rigby had about 10 routes, and they all lined up in a row just before school let out to wait for their load. And I got there a few minutes before, and there she was sitting there waiting with all the rest with a team. She had harnessed herself and would have to unharness and care for her after she got home along with other chores. I think that was really the first time it really hit me, what she had gone through to keep me out. I had a younger brother at home then, Harvey, and he was getting old enough to be of considerable help with chores and so forth, and a younger sister, Eleanor, was also home, so she was not entirely alone. But it was, I think, too much of a responsibility for her to have to assume, and I should have been there to help. Harvey was quite young when Father died, and lacking the companionship and discipline of a father, he missed out on early childhood training that is important to a child. As a result of this, he was hard to control and was for some time, until he got older, erratic in his work habits. 4/24/78. Delia's in Twin Falls, and I am alone, so I have more time to write. I removed a large flowering shrub this morning from the backyard and will plant a walnut tree in its place. The anniversary issue of Dialogue came today, and a letter I wrote them was published in it. It looked pretty good in print. To get back to my story, as I said, I came home from my mission in 1932, and the Depression was still on. Nobody talked about careers, just how to survive. Delia and I were married in 1933, February 1, in the Logan Temple, Utah. It was one of the coldest winters I have ever seen. Lots of snow and blizzard conditions constantly. All the roads were closed and stayed that way all winter. We went to Rigby in a bobsleigh. Clifford took us up. Then we rode the train to Logan, walked from the depot to Aunt Loam's place and stayed there that night. Walked down to the temple the next morning and went through and were married. Just the two of us, didn't know a soul, don't even remember who married us, although I could look on the certificate and find out, I guess. Then afterwards we walked around Logan all day. Didn't see a damn soul we knew until about 5 that afternoon, when we met a kid I used to go to school with, and I chatted with him about 5 minutes. Stayed in a hotel that night, I forget which one, and the next morning came back to Rigby on the train. Well, as you can see, as weddings go, it was kind of flat by anybody's standards. We probably picked the worst time in weather and economics to get married. But you do the best you can with what you have to work with, so that's what we did. It isn't the wedding that's so important anyway, it's what you make out of the marriage. In this, I was lucky in a partner. Delia has always been willing to do more than her share. Well, by the time we got back, we'd both spent all our money, and Clifford had a $5 gold piece he had been saving, and he gave that to us. Wish I'd kept it. It would have been worth something now. But we spent it. We had to. There was a song popular then that pretty well summed it up. I can't give you anything but love. Delia's folks let us stay there the rest of the winter, and in the spring we moved into a small apartment in Rigby. I think we paid $5 a month rent. We worked for her father. I worked for her father for a while, helping him put in his crop. Next fall I got a job in a potato warehouse sorting potatoes. Then they paid 30 cents an hour, and only when the sorter was running, so there was usually about a half of every day you didn't get paid for. Dwayne was born in May the following year, and shortly after I went to Arizona to see if I could find work. My brother-in-law George Wood said maybe he could get me on with standard stations. I hitchhiked down and stayed with 10 and late for a while, and eventually he got me on with them. First paycheck I got, I rented an apartment, but didn't have any money for utility deposits, so lived in it without lights until next paycheck. The ventilation was poor, and it was so hot I couldn't sleep, so to get any rest I would throw a sheet in the bathtub, soak it with cold, tepid water, and then wrap up in it and go to bed. Delia came down that fall. Her folks brought her. It was their first trip to the Southwest. Shortly after they left, I got transferred to Benson and spent a couple of years there working for standard stations. It was almost all Mexican in a small town. Delia didn't like it, but I did. I hooked up with a Mexican dance band and kept busy 1 or 2 nights a week playing dances Mexican style. Had a lot of fun, but I did feel sorry for her. She would be home waiting and alone with Dwayne. She couldn't stand the heat there in the summer. She lost weight and appetite, so I put her up on the train and sent her home, and she came back in the fall. We finally left Arizona and went to Logan, Utah, and tried to make it selling Maytag washers for a dealer there. It was straight commission, and I couldn't sell enough to survive, so we later quit, went to Rigby, and went to work for CW&M, a farm machinery store. We both enjoyed Logan. Would really like to have stayed there, but they just starved us out. After we got to Rigby, we made 2 or 3 moves and finally got a real nice house to rent. It was the first we had that looked like a home. Stayed there for a couple of years, I guess, but wasn't getting anywhere financially, and there were rumors they were going to close the store, so we quit and went back to Arizona and leased a signal station in Tucson. We operated this for about 18 months and had a lot of fun along with the work. By that time we had Sunda, and we lived in a small house way out on the outskirts of the Northeast. Later, after World War II started, I got a chance to sell the station, and I went to San Diego and took a course in sheet metal at Lindbergh Field. Delia went back to her folks while I was in San Diego, which was about 3 or 4 months. She says she had a real good time that winter. Clifford was on his mission, and her and Ruth, my sister, and Delia's mother and grandmother were living together, and they spent most of the winter playing pinochle. I didn't have a good time. I lived in a dump, and I was lonesome, but I stuck it out, and after completing the course went to Los Angeles and went to work for Douglas Aircraft in their engine cowling department. Delia came down in the spring, and we moved into an apartment complex, kind of a court. All the guys were mostly working for Douglas, and all the gals would get together in the evenings. I worked swing and have a gab session. She says she really enjoyed it there too, and I did also. We hadn't been there too long when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, and from then on it was nothing but work, lots of overtime, lots of blackouts, bomb shelters, camouflage, balloons, gun placements, the works. I transferred to inspection later and spent the entire war in the Douglas Santa Monica plant. While we were there, Rowan was born. Our first out of state and our first in a hospital, St. John's in Santa Monica. Dwayne was born in Delia's folks' home, and Sunda was born in a maternity home in Rigby. Later, when Michael came along, he was born in the same maternity home. After the war, there was substantial contract cancellation, and I got restless waiting to be laid off, so I quit and went to work for a bottled water company in East Los Angeles selling bottled water on a route. They furnished the customers and the truck, and I did the work and made the collections. I made about twice the money there that I did at Douglas. We bought our first home while we were with Douglas. It was brand new and located in Culver City, not far from MGM Studio. We really enjoyed it there, and the fact that at last we had something of our own. After I'd been with the water company a little over a year, I noticed that practically all the men that had been with them for any length of time were crippled with arthritis from carrying water all day long. I decided that wasn't for me, so when we had a chance to sell our house for twice what we paid for it, we sold and left California and went back to Rigby. We got there in the middle of October and was glad to see our kids again. We sent Dwayne and Son on ahead of us, and they had been there for a month or so. We helped her brother Clifford harvest his potatoes, then moved in with her mother for the winter. Delia's mother at that time was widowed and living in Rigby. While there, I tore out her kitchen cabinet and built another one. Didn't know a nail from a hammer, but I had a good carpenter friend, Lyle Peterson, and I kept bothering him until he took pity on me and got me started. From there on, it was all downhill. We were looking around all the time for something to buy, and in February we bought an 80-acre farm just east of Rigby. The family that sold it left all their livestock, so I drove out every morning to do chores until March when we moved out. We had an enjoyable approximately 8 years here. Lots of work, lots of fun. The kids were growing up, they enjoyed the farm, and although we had been moderately active in church activities most of our life, we got very active here as we both got jobs in the stake MIA. I was activity counselor and Delia was secretary. We went a lot, danced a lot, and it was an enjoyable time in our lives. Dwayne graduated from high school here, and Michael was born while we were on the farm. Gradually, it got a little harder to make ends meet, and I finally left one fall and went to Seattle and went to work for Boeing. I intended to stay for just a while, but one thing led to another, and we finally moved over, and later I got a chance to sell the farm for a modest profit. That was a hard move for me. I hated to leave that farm, but once gone, I soon became interested in other things. From an educational standpoint, it was a good move. I learned more while I was with Boeing than all the rest of the time before. The B-52 was just being built, and I got in on the first of them. They needed skilled systems men, and I spent many months in special schools learning B-52 systems. I finally had them all and was certified to operate anything on the airplane, including the engines. I also worked on the Beaumark missiles while in Seattle. We later transferred to Moses Lake, and I worked flight line there on B-52. While there, they wanted me to go back to Seattle as a supervisor on the KC-135 in the factory, but I turned that down. I later transferred to KC-135s in Moses Lake when they reached there. We bought a house in Moses Lake, which we still own at this writing. Sunday graduated from high school there, and Roanne graduated from high school there. I and the family were active in the church. I worked in the Sunday school superintendency and later was a counselor to Bishop Harris for a little over a year until he moved to Pasco. Sunday got married in Moses Lake and was married the first time in the home that we own there. They later did it again in the temple. I forget which one. The airplane contract finally wound down, and I transferred back to Seattle on the Minuteman missile program. We were all agreed on one thing. We hated Seattle, so when this happened, we didn't move. I commuted. I stayed over there during the week and come home on weekends. This went on for over 1 year till I was able to transfer on remote assignment. I then went to Great Falls, Montana for about a year and still hadn't moved, but was commuting about every 3 months by airplane. Later I went to Kenmare, North Dakota, when we installed missiles there, and it was there that we got the family together again and lived in an Air Force trailer. Dwayne got married while we were in Great Falls, and Mike had just flown out from Spokane to be with me for a week, so we both flew into Idaho Falls for the wedding, where we met the rest of the family.